Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association podcast. From roundtable discussions of current health topics to recaps of our panels with distinguished leaders in the healthcare field to even meeting current student leaders within the organization, this is White Coats and Rice. My name is Annie Nguyen, and I am the Women in Medicine Director at APAMSA. I'll be your host for today. Today, we'll be meeting with Abbey Zhu from Canwin as part of our Women in Medicine series in the APAMSA podcast. In this podcast, we dive into topics ranging from experiences as an Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander woman in medicine to broader topics like women's health advocacy. Abby will be sharing with us today about Canwin's mission and their work in working with domestic violence survivors and other survivors of violence within the AANHPI community. Hey everyone, so we're here today with Abby from Canwin. Abby, could you go ahead and introduce yourself first and a little bit about Canwin?
Yes. Hello. My name is Abby. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the community engagement team lead at Canwin. And Canwin is a culturally specific nonprofit organization based in the Chicagoland area, serving Asian immigrant and Asian American survivors of gender-based violence. So, what that looks like is we serve survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, and we have direct services available for them. So, that includes legal advocacy, counseling, general wraparound case management, but we also have a super robust community engagement and outreach and education team. So we're doing both the immediate crisis intervention work, but also trying to lay the foundations for a lot of community and social change so that hopefully we can equip all community members, regardless of whether or not they're working for a domestic violence agency, with the skills, knowledge, and confidence to be able to support and advocate with survivors of domestic violence.
Thank you for sharing about Canwin's mission. It sounds like y'all do a lot of great work within the community, especially with different multifaceted approaches, like you were saying. I was wondering if you could share with us some unique challenges that Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander survivors of trauma and violence face when seeking medical or psychological support, especially because Canwin has such a strong culturally responsive focus.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this during the intro, but at Canwin, our staff speak Korean, Mongolian, and Mandarin Chinese, and we were actually founded by Korean advocates in 1990. So this is our 35th year anniversary of serving clients in the Chicagoland area. But related to that, right, because we're doing both the direct service work and doing the community outreach and education work, just getting a general pulse on how the community's doing, kind of what victim blaming attitudes they might be internalizing, and then also just the fears that survivors themselves might face in like coming forward, asking us for help, even identifying as a survivor. I think especially in a lot of immigrant communities, a lot of our communities are very tight-knit, right? We depend a lot on
Mm.
each other because obviously the United States is not an incredibly welcoming space for immigrants, an incredibly welcoming space for people of color. It's so beautiful the ways that we're able to build these strong communities, but at the same time, because of how tight-knit they might be, there's a really strong fear of gossip, or there might be a really strong fear of folks stepping, quote unquote, stepping out of line. And so there might be a lot of silencing or shame in identifying as a survivor of domestic violence. I think one of the most prominent issues that Canwin has been addressing since our founding is even identifying or naming something as violence. When people immigrate to the US, after they get to the US, there's so much structural, systemic, and also interpersonal violence that people might feel like they have to normalize or be okay with to literally just survive. So I think the biggest challenge is what someone might perceive of as normal, actually naming it as violence and being like, this isn't okay. And I think for a lot of people too, they might have grown up in families where there wasn't mutual respect between parents, or there might have been power dynamics between parents or power dynamic between parents and children. And when there is a power dynamic, then violence might be seen as justified, right? So I think our biggest challenge has been going out into communities, doing a lot of education around healthy relationships, not just like how do you identify domestic violence, but like how do you actually build a healthy relationship with the person you're dating, the person you're married to, parents and children, and How do we talk about things like consent, not just in the terms of like sex and dating, but also between family members and trying to change the norms around how we are in relationship with each other, especially while dating or within the family, and really, really pushing for that like norms change at the community level, not only so that we build those healthy communities and families and relationships that we want to see everywhere, but also so if someone does experience violence, that they're able to identify it, name it, and not have any fear around disclosing to people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that because this is such a sensitive topic, a lot of the time you want to make sure that you cultivate a safe space for that person to, come forward themselves and be willing to put themselves forward in a way that, like, at their own pace and everything like that. So I think, like you were saying, big issues are like just starting the conversation in the first place and then getting a sense of what that person even thinks is normal or what they're like potentially minimizing in their life. So I was wondering for Canwin, because you were talking about education and community outreach for y'all, how do you guys get people to be receptive to your efforts, or how do you start these conversations in the first place?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think it's something we continue to try to figure out. I mean, at Canwin, we have a multilingual advocacy team as well as community engagement team. So we work together, but we're also separate departments. You can think of us as separate but partner departments. And for our multilingual advocacy program, they are people who are bilingual, so fluent in an Asian language and also fluent in English. And they explicitly do education and outreach to immigrant communities where people might not be speaking English as their first language. So we have a Mandarin Chinese speaking advocate, a Korean speaking advocate who also does a lot of targeted outreach to Korean faith communities, so Korean Christian communities. And then we also have a Mongolian advocate. And I think it helps so much, obviously, to be able to do things in language. So much of our values are also embodied in our language, and that being able to have someone who can translate and interpret so skillfully is really important. And then also, I think depending on like what generation immigrant you might be, that also is going to change your lived experience, your values, and the way that you move through the world. So I think having that team is so, so helpful because they're generally targeting older folks, first generation folks, people who don't speak English as their first language, and really just laying the groundwork for, okay, like, hey, like a lot of the things that you've experienced in life are really, really messed up. And like a
Mhm.
lot of them can change and can be different, especially for future generations. And on the community engagement team, we're mostly English speaking. We have a youth and young adult organizer who explicitly does education and outreach to Asian American high school students. We focus on college students, and then also like professional to professional training. It's like certification training, sexual harassment training, bystander intervention, etc. But what we've been trying to do is try to also do more just like intergenerational dialogue. So actually, this past February, our youth and young adult organizer, our faith advocate, our Korean speaking faith advocate, and then also members of our direct service team did a whole month of workshops and programming with Korean churches. So they did workshops on teen dating violence because February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. And they did workshops just for the parents specifically, just like what they should know about teen dating violence, how to support their children, how to maybe identify it as well. And then for the teens themselves, our youth and young adult organizer and an art therapist on staff did workshops around boundaries, consent, basically how to maintain healthy relationships. Think about healthy relationships both within the context of family, but also dating, and an art therapy workshop that kind of also helped facilitate how do I want to set up boundaries? What kind of boundaries do I want to enforce, et cetera, et cetera. And they also created a brochure so that parents and children could have a dialogue with each other. And so this very targeted intergenerational outreach, I think, was super well received. I mean, it's something that parents will always be worried about. They don't want their children to be facing violence, right? And then for children, empowering them to be able to keep themselves safe and then also set the foundations for the types of relationships that they want to have was so, so helpful. And I think like we want to keep being able to do that into the future because I think parenting workshops have been super helpful, especially among first-gen immigrants, people who don't speak English as their first language, and our multilingual advocates have done consent and parenting workshops so often. And we want to be able to keep developing that and keep creating conversations between generations, just so that we can like really clearly emphasize that there are folks in the community who are thinking about this, who recognize that mental health is a really big issue, that creating healthy relationships is really difficult within immigrant families. And how do we start doing that? Start saying, like, some of these things that might have been seen as normal are actually not okay. And how do I know that other people also have my back and are going to support me in trying to create a different or better future for all of us? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you brought up really great points about like the very targeted interventions because these are like issues that affect many people of like many different backgrounds within the same community. I like the work that you did with the Korean children and things like that because it's just you're really utilizing something that is like a sense of a support system for people who are going through things. And then by partnering with them, you can create a much stronger and safe space for people to talk about things. I think for us as future healthcare providers, that learning how to build and create this safe, supportive space is, something that like we're always keeping in mind when we talk to patients. So I was just wondering if you had any tips for how clinicians or healthcare providers can navigate these conversations about difficult topics like violence, especially maybe in terms of language, so we can approach care without potentially traumatizing or just kind of like assessing the situation when we meet patients who we think might be going through something.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And like my first instinct to answer that question is just like to be curious about your patients, to ask questions that might not just be directly related to their symptoms or what they're coming in to seek care for, but genuinely being curious about patients' lives and getting the context for why this person came in the first place. And I think just having longer conversations with someone reveals so much, especially for domestic violence survivors or really anyone who's a survivor of like racialized violence or economic violence, etc., right? What beyond like the medical care that can be provided, maybe I can refer someone to a social service organization that could provide economic financial assistance or housing assistance, rental assistance, if someone's worried about insurance or like paying for their healthcare and giving them information about Medicaid or other affordable healthcare options in your city or in your state. I think with domestic violence, I'm quite sure almost every state has their own version of what might be called 40-hour training. And that's basically just a really intensive training where you get trained on how to identify domestic violence, identify dynamics of domestic violence, how to support survivors, and basically also how to treat survivors in as much as possible a trauma-informed way. And I know the word trauma-informed is such like an amorphous, like bubbly word, like what does that actually mean? But to me, it really just means recognizing and acknowledging that no one ever faces violence, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be medical violence, again, like economic violence, racial violence, etc. None of that happens in a vacuum. And like understanding on a deep level that the world that we live in is so unjust in so many different ways. And so when someone comes to me because they've experienced violence in some way or another, recognizing that it's never just on the interpersonal level, but there are so many reasons why that person experienced violence and why they're here today, and like trying my best to be able to understand the context in which the violence happened and not just like the manifestation, maybe the physical manifestations of violence in the current moment, if that makes sense. So I think just being curious, asking questions, and trying to get as much context as possible. And then if you have the time and you can get your workplace to pay for it, because it's usually so expensive, getting 40-hour trained is super, super helpful in just getting a deeper understanding of what domestic violence looks like and how to specifically support survivors.
Yeah, I think that what you were saying about the training and figuring out the context, it's all so important. It's something that we need to keep in our minds constantly. Someone might not be coming to you to tell you their whole backstory, but then if you kind of like make a space, elicit information, you can, then gather that context and really help them to the fullest. I'm really interested in the 40-hour training that you were talking about. I was wondering if you could tell us more about that or other resources and training that you would recommend medical students and other clinicians within this working with this community who want to improve their ability to provide trauma-informed care.
Yeah, so the 40-hour training is specific to Illinois. In Illinois, if you want to work with domestic violence survivors in a one-on-one setting, so work at a domestic violence agency, volunteer for a hotline, volunteer for a shelter, etc., you're required to get 40 hours of training first before you can start working with those survivors. Basically, it's just a law that's like we want to make sure that folks working with survivors are not going to re-traumatize survivors. In New York or in other states, I'm yeah, quite confident that there are probably other training requirements for y'all, but generally domestic violence agencies or organizations will host 40-hour trainings throughout the year. You can register for them. Some of them are all online, some of them might be 20 hours of self-paced learning, 20 hours of in-person training, but it is a really, really great way to get really, really in the weeds of just dynamics of domestic violence, legal options for survivors, medical options for survivors, and also like history of the anti-violence movement as well. So it's a great, like, kind of like foundational training for you to be able to expand your knowledge of how to support survivors of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. And then in terms of other trainings, I think really just any professional trainings that you can register for that deepen your knowledge of anti-bias work, just anti-racism, just any trainings where you can learn more deeply about the structures and systems of our world and how they impact people on the individual level and how that's going to impact the way they show up when they come to a hospital or when they come to a clinic or when they come to the doctors. I think there are so many really amazing organizations who provide and do trainings on that because, again, like we grow up in a world learning so many narratives about so many different people. And so there's a lot of stuff for all of us to unlearn because our brains are wired to think in very specific ways, and we might not even be noticing that we're thinking or behaving and therefore acting in a way that is actually really harmful towards other people. So, yeah, those are my recommendations.
Mhm. On that topic, then, what do you think are some common misconceptions about trauma and how it can impact patients' health and well-being? Just so we, know to look out for what we want to unlearn and things like that.
Yeah, I think in the context of domestic violence, the biggest misconception is that the only thing that counts as domestic violence is physical violence. So people might only be looking
Mhm.
for physical signs of injury, whether that be bruises, like choke marks around the neck, broken bones, etc. But what we know as folks working in the anti-violence movement, as people serving survivors of domestic violence, is that domestic violence is so much more than that. It could look like sexual violence, including sexual
Mhm.
assault. It could look like tampering with someone's birth control, forcing someone to have a child if they don't want to have a child. It could look like emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, not letting someone get a job, not letting someone have their own bank account. And like that doesn't manifest physically, right? But all of that trauma, even if it is like quote unquote psychological, is going to show up in the body in different ways. So a lot of our survivors might be like, oh, like I've had chronic stomach pain for months. And like
Mhm.
that stomach pain obviously is a manifestation of like the abuse and violence that they've been enduring, but it shows up as this like body problem that might feel like where did this come from, and also like oh at the same time like that's just a stomach ache, right? But
Mhm.
as y'all know, as medical professionals, as medical students, all of the violence, even if it isn't physical, is going to show up in our bodies in different ways, whether that's mental health difficulties or issues, whether it's chronic pain, chronic stress, high blood pressure, headaches, right? Thinking about that, and then also thinking about how you never really quote unquote completely heal from trauma. It's always going to stay in the body in some way or another. Might show up as PTSD, again, might show up as chronic pain, but just like getting rid of the idea that like things can be quote unquote fixable, but rather empowering survivors, giving them the tools, the empathy, and the space to decide for themselves what they want their healing journeys to look like. And also being really honest with survivors. I think that's something that we repeat over and over again is that we're never going to overpromise to survivors when we do legal advocacy, right? Applying for a restraining order or order of protection, when we help clients apply, we're not going to say, like, you will be able to get this for sure, right? We're going to be like, hey, we're going to help you get this. It's ultimately up to a judge. And I feel like in medical context, it's a similar thing of like, we're going to do our best to address this and work through this together. But again, right, like, there's no guarantee that it's going to be over or gone completely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about that. I do think that, like you were saying, it's really easy for people to get caught up with these kind of quote unquote classic or typical expectations of what like a survivor would look like. So
Mhm.
just being like very open minded to, how people might come in with different experiences and then being honest with them, I think would definitely help a lot in terms of, how to catch people while they're, in a place where they might need help.
Mhm.
So I was also wondering if you could tell us if there are any policy or changes that you think would improve trauma-informed care in medical settings as well.
Mm. Oh, good question. Hmm. I think in an ideal world, and if there were
Hmm.
enough resources and enough time, because I know y'all are also so overworked,
Hmm.
every medical professional, if not to get 40-hour trained, but at least to get basic domestic violence or intimate partner violence training so that
Hmm.
they're able to identify or or if identify domestic violence survivors or if someone discloses to them, like knows what they need to do to be able to refer that survivor to the resources or services that they might need. And then I also think just increased partnerships between domestic violence organizations and hospitals or like medical groups. I know that there are a lot of domestic violence
Hmm.
agencies in the Chicagoland area who have partnerships with certain hospital or medical groups in the Chicagoland area where those hospitals provide reduced cost or just like no cost care to survivors if they were to come in to the hospital requiring care after experiencing domestic violence. I also know that there are really strong referral networks. So if someone comes into the emergency room after having experienced really severe physical domestic violence, that a nurse has the knowledge and knows who to call and can knows how to speak to the survivor and ask, hey, like, do you want me to call a hotline with you? And then since they have that like referral network and those partnerships with those TV organizations, they also medical staff know who to call. And I think also this is more like a policy level and less on like a individual
Hmm.
medical professional level, but ensuring federally, like nationwide, that all people have affordable healthcare and
Hmm.
so that people aren't afraid to ask for care. I think that is one of the biggest barriers as well of like, oh, how am I going to pay for this if I were to go in to ask for testing, screening, medication, etc. And a big part of our advocates work at Kinwin too is trying to find as much as possible state or government assistance for our survivors because a lot of are limited English speakers or might be low income or don't have a lot of financial independence because of the abuse that they've been enduring. So, short answer to all this is just more just policies for all people and then also stronger partnerships and collaborations between the medical field and domestic violence field.
Hmm. Yes, I totally agree with all of that. Like just like the stronger partnerships, like I mentioned before, working within the community, I think is so powerful because, like if y'all like Canwin already have a great network with people that, you're seeing survivors, your clients, then, having medical groups partner with you guys really just capitalizes on that sense of trust and we can really more effectively like help y'all with your mission and like approach like people who are survivors of violence in a way that's familiar to them, safer for them. And then in addition, like you were saying with the policies, especially the financial aspect that you were mentioning, I think that's huge. Just removing that burden kind of opens up a whole new world, or it makes it so that people aren't afraid to ask for help when they
Right.
need it.
Mhm, mhm.
So I think for our last question, I was wondering if you could let listeners know where they can hear more about Canwin's work, what are ways for them to get involved, and any exciting kind of new services or programs that you guys are doing.
Yeah, so best way to stay updated on our work is to follow our Instagram. Our handle is at Canwin Chicago. So KANWIN Chicago, all one word, no spaces or underscores. And our website is canwin.org. And you can subscribe to our newsletter there. Our website also regularly updates like news and updates. So great way to stay updated on the work we're doing.
Great. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, sharing with us, more information about how to interact with survivors of violence, especially the tips on trauma-informed care and culturally responsive methods. I think this was a great conversation. I learned a lot. I hope that the people listening learn a lot too. But yeah, thank you again so much for meeting with us and sharing today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me and coordinating this. It was an honor.